Seraphin, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And I'm so happy to speak to you today. What I want to talk about today is the way in which that notion of some kind of fundamental homelessness or non-belonging or not fitting into your symbolic identity is really crucial. And I think that that's what constitutes what is, I think, most important. So our solidarity and our sense of a public. So I think, though, I'm talking about the term alienation, and I think one of the problems with the term is that it misleads. And I think the reason for its misleading is that it suggests that we're alienated from something, that there's some prior identity, some romantic past, something that we've lost in the process of alienation. And there's some problem maybe even in the term itself. But the reason why I want to keep the term, I want to guard it and use it, is because I think we should shift the focus a little bit and think about the word alien within that term and the way in which what it suggests is that there's an alien within, there's a German word for alienation, Entfremdung, the fremd, the foreign within. And I think that's the sense in which I want to understand the word, and which I think is really important, that this foreign or alien within is what everyone has to deal with, that doesn't and isn't connected to any kind of fundamental human essence. It's not connected to anything that's shared substantively, but it's connected to what we share that we don't have, this failure to fit in. So there's not some kind of fall from an original identity that was once whole or harmonious. And I think that's the common way that alienation is understood, always suggests this return to something that's been lost, or it suggests, certainly in the Marxist tradition, a movement towards some kind of harmonious future. The point is, as I just said, that alienation refers, or estrangement, speaks to what's foreign within us and what can't be integrated into our symbolic identity. So it's this internal distance of the subject from itself that makes any full identification or full achievement of a symbolic identity impossible. And it also makes any communal, it's also the barrier to any communal life, what Immanuel Kant called our unsociable sociability, right? So we're drawn to be together, but we can't fully fit together. And I think that's the source of not our community, but it's the source of our solidarity with each other. So again, this alienation is this signifier for me of this alien within. The problem is that I think for much of the 19th, but especially the 20th century, alienation has signified a political problem or even a moral problem that we have to get beyond. I think typically on the left, it's been seen as a political problem, and on the right, it's been seen as a moral problem that we have to in some way overcome and get beyond. And that's what I want to push against and say, well, no, actually alienation is the source of everything that's emancipatory is tied to this internal distance from ourselves, because that's the thing that liberates us. It emancipates us from what we are given as we start out. And I think the thinker that, I don't mean to pick on him because I really, in general, like Herbert Marcuse as a thinker. I think the thinker that embodies this critique of alienation in the 20th century, probably more than any other, is maybe the synecdoche for the whole idea, is Herbert Marcuse, who was both a Marxist and tried to synthesize Marx and Freud famously in Eros and Civilization, but also in One-Dimensional Man. What's very interesting to me about Marcuse is that he was also very influenced by Hegel. So he wrote 2 books on Hegel. One, Reason and Revolution, which I think pretty good and an important book on Hegel. And Hegel, for me, is really the thinker of alienation. So Marcuse's take on alienation seems to me the point at which his brand of Marxism gets the better of his investment in Hegel. And I think this line really encapsulates what the tenor of his take on alienation. He said, this is in Reason and Revolution, which, as I said, is a book on Hegel. This is what he says. He says, individuals are isolated from and set against each other. They are linked in the commodities they exchange rather than in their persons. Man's alienation from himself is simultaneously an estrangement from his fellow men. So what's interesting about Marcuse's statement here for me is the way that he links our self-alienation to the failure of solidarity. And so I want to really almost totally reverse this quotation and say, no, it's precisely our alienation from ourselves that is the thing that connects us to other people, not the thing that estranges us from other people. So I understand, of course, where Marcuse is coming from and how, especially the tradition of the 1844 manuscripts is really weighing heavily on what he's saying here. And Lukács, obviously, History and Class Consciousness from 1922. It's also important in this statement. But I think there is this problem, this romantic sense of alienation and the possibility of overcoming it that really informs this statement and makes it, for me, a problem. So again, for Marcuse, alienation's the barrier to solidarity. And I would just put it like this, that I think alienation is a barrier to community, but it is the basis of solidarity. And I think that distinction is going to be really important. And I think contra him, as I said, it's our alienation that's the source of our solidarity, the source of what makes our connection to each other possible. And again, I want to emphasize this difference between community and the public, which is constituted through solidarity. So the notion that a community, and I think that for me, the key to the difference is that a community, we seek out in a community a place where we feel safe, and we feel safe in what for me is not a good sense. And we feel like we're protected there because everyone in the community shares a symbolic identity with us. Whereas in the public, there's always a certain kind of vulnerability, not physical vulnerability necessarily, but vulnerability in the sense that I'm going to encounter somebody whose views that I don't necessarily share and whose position might make me uncomfortable. And so that for me is the essence of what it means to be in public. So when you're in public, you're open. And I think the German word Öffentlichkeit is nice, that you're out in the open, you're exposed in a way in the public, and in the community, you're protected much more. So I like this opposition between the communal bond and public solidarity. And I think it's hard. What I like about public solidarity is it almost seems oxymoronic, because there's the public, people don't feel necessarily solidarity out in public. They feel, oh, everyone else there's all these other different things going on. I feel like I'm a little bit a sea, I'm lost. But I think that actually is this real source of our only possible solidarity with other people, because what we really share is that feeling of, I don't fit, there's no place here I fit in. And that very thing, that failure to fit in, is the source of the connection. And I think in the public, and that's why I think public is a really important thing to defend. And I think especially in our time, as the public becomes more and more under assault, it becomes increasingly exigent that we do whatever we can to defend it. And I think there's an alignment, not just between the communal bond, or an opposition, not just between the communal bond and public solidarity, but between the symbolic identity that's affirmed in the community and the alienated subjectivity that we experience in the public. So there's no one feels like when you're in public that you're just, your symbolic identity is secured. And so I think that's what's really, that gives the public and being in the public its radical dimension, whereas the communal bond gets established through a shared symbolic identity. And so even though there are obviously conflicts within a community, they nonetheless have as their aim, we're going to keep out everyone that doesn't share this symbolic identity, as a way of reducing your experience of alienation. So the point of the community is, how can we lessen alienation as much as we can, even though, of course, it's impossible to completely get rid of it, because there's always going to be intra-communal disputes, conflicts, etc. But the point is to obviate that as much as possible. Whereas in the public, there isn't this sense of trying to create a secure symbolic identity. And so that, I think, is a really crucial difference, that it doesn't have this striving to avoid alienation. In fact, the public is constantly doing things that force us to confront our alienation. So there's sure, there can be, there are things that are done in public to keep us safe, physically safe and alive, like building sidewalks, something like that. But there's nothing to say, okay, certain people can't walk. I'm going to talk about this later, but you can't say certain people can't walk on the sidewalk, certain people can't ride on the bus. Okay, that does happen, but those are cases where the community overruns the public and gets in the way of the solidarity that's created in the public. So I think that is the key, that the public really, when it gets overrun by the community, then this alienating factor starts to disappear. But the public itself is nourished by alienated subjectivity, and in turn nourishes that subjectivity. That if we reject our alienation totally, which I think sadly is kind of what's happening today, that there's more and more rejection of alienation and attempts to overcome it and retreat into private communities, even when out in public. So for instance, if I'm out in public, I'm in an elevator, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, and I look down at my phone rather than stand awkwardly with everyone else, what am I doing? I'm trying to avoid that experience of alienation in the public by a retreat into some kind of community thing, like the email that someone has written me, my own little private, or the text, whatever private message I have. And it's a way of not confronting the fact that no one is at home in the public. And I think it's interesting because there are people that, of course, that live in the public, and the name for them, I think, is interesting, is homeless, right? So if you're homeless, you are stuck living in the public. And I think that's the point, is that there's no home there. And so I think that's really important to think about, that absence of a home is precisely what gives the public its, for me, radical edge, because it does have this connection to alienation, and there's no sense that we're at home there. So we're constantly encountering disturbances to our symbolic identity that we wouldn't necessarily encounter in a private community. And so that for me is really crucial, that you're riding on a public bus, you never know what's going to happen, who you're going to be seated next to. You're walking down the sidewalk, it's not clear who you're going to run into. It could be someone that doesn't fit, and it could be someone that's just starts screaming for no reason, right? You never know what's going to happen when you're in the public. And that for me is really important. And I want to show a couple of little filmic depictions, very quick ones, of the way in which the public is shown in order to emphasize the alienating structure at work in the public. And the first one I want to show is a very famous auction scene in Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, where Cary Grant, Roger Thornhill is the name of the character, is at an auction, and he wants the police to arrest him. So before what we're seeing, I'm going to show you just a little clip when he's it starts to get more annoying. But he instead of bidding, as you're at auction, everyone knows you're supposed to bid a higher bid, and he bids a lower bid. And so it starts to disrupt the proceedings. And then I'll show you, as you'll see in the scene, he really starts to throw things off.
Sold for $22.50. And now
$22.50 for that chromo?
number 110 in the catalog. A Louis XV carved and gilded lit de repos. Would somebody start the bidding at $750, please?
How do we know it's not a fake? It looks like a fake.
Well, one thing we know, you're no fake. You're a genuine idiot.
Okay, I've always liked that line, and I've always wanted to use it, and I've never quite found the time, but or found the perfect opportunity. But one can, I think, I like this idea that in public, one can always be seated next to a genuine idiot. So there's nothing to stop. Ultimately, the police do come and stop him when he just causes too much of a disturbance. But in the public, and that is true, eventually there's some kind of barrier. But what's important, I think, is that initially there's not that barrier. That there's always someone, you're always threatened to be next to someone who isn't playing the game like everybody else is playing it. And I think that's really a crucial thing. Or you can be positioned next to somebody who's completely annoying, and that's what happens. I'm going to show you just a little clip of this person, someone on a public bus who's confronting someone who's really annoying in a almost as great a masterpiece as North by Northwest, but maybe less heralded.
You know, it took me 3 hours just to get here from the airport. I got so lost. LA is one large place. Of course, you live here, you probably don't notice. I'm such a yokel.
Jeez.
There, I said it.
You know what? I got gum on my seat. Gum. Excuse me.
All right, so Annie, the Sandra Bullock character, she's stuck by this. You can tell he's preparing for his later role in Succession by being very annoying. She's seated next to someone who's annoying, and then what I like about this is, in order to get away from him, she does the other thing that is annoying about the public is she acts like she's seen on gum. So the fact that you can sit on gum, the seat can be smelly, all these kinds of things. So the point is, all that's involved in the public, and the public doesn't keep anyone out because it doesn't form through exclusion. And I think that's a crucial difference between the community and the public, is that the public doesn't have this necessary exclusion, whereas every community is established through a gate. So we have this phenomenon, I hope it's only in America, of the gated community. And I want to say, no, every community is a gated community. Every community, whether the gate is physical or just psychic, every community is constituted through keeping people out, and the public isn't. And so the point is that the community is founded not just on keeping people out, but through the figure of the outsider. So I know I belong to the community because I can identify who's outside the community. So the great philosopher Kenneth Burke once said, talking to someone who's a Christian, he said, "I know you're a Christian, but what are you a Christian against?" And that idea that even among the Christian community, which is supposed to be a community of universal love, and so everyone is supposed to be included, in order to function as a community, someone has to be excluded. You have to be a Christian against someone. And that notion of the outsider is really absolutely vital to the community. And every conception of inclusion requires that problem. So the difference is that public spaces or public institutions or public exchanges don't involve that. So they don't know, for them to occur, there's no one necessarily excluded. So it doesn't feel like, and I think this is the crucial thing, it doesn't feel like you belong when you're in the public, because it doesn't have this figure of exclusion that creates the sense of belonging. So that's the idea, that the public doesn't form through exclusion in the same way that the community does. And that, I think, is part, and the disturbing quality of being in public is I think behind this contemporary retreat from all forms of the public. And in fact, it was already commented upon in 1994 by Joan Kopchak in Read My Desire, in which she says that this contemporary retreat into privacy entails the destruction of the civitas itself, of increasingly larger portions of our public space. We no longer attempt to safeguard the empty private space, but to dwell within this space exclusively. And it's very interesting because when she's in making this comment, it occurs during a discussion of film noir. And her point is, film noir is basically an exploration of this way in which, of the ramifications of the retreat into privacy. And she talks about this especially in analysis of double indemnity. What's interesting to me is that thinkers have typically seen the public, and this is why they've denounced it, as the site of conformity. And I was thinking of three thinkers, Soren Kierkegaard, Martin Heidegger, and Jacques Lacan. So Kierkegaard has a concept which he just calls the public. Heidegger, of course, the idea of das Mann, or translated in English as the they, and then Jacques Lacan's le grand autre, or the big other. So these three thinkers have some conception of that they link the public sphere, the public life with conformity, and privacy is a way to escape from that, or that the force of conformity can be countered only for them in private. Maybe Lacan is a little different. So here's how Kierkegaard puts it. He's the originator, I think, of this idea. Only when there is no strong communal life to give substance to the connection between people, will the press create this abstraction, the public, made up of unsubstantial individuals who are never united and never can be united in the simultaneity of any situation or organization, and yet are claimed to be a whole. The public is a core, outnumbering all the people together, but this core can never be called up for inspection. Indeed, it cannot even have so much as a single representative, because it is itself an abstraction. And he says this in a great little section of a book called The Present Age, which is in the larger set of reviews called The Two Ages. And this really sets the stage for, especially for Heidegger. Basically, Heidegger takes this over totally, but also for Lacan, I think, in Lacan's conception of the big other. And there's this general suspicion on the part of all three that the public is what destroys our individuality. And this destruction, I want to say, well, to me, no, what the destruction of our particularity is, for me, what gives the public its alienating quality, and it's also its emancipatory quality, because our particularity is what's just given to us socially. So our particularity, I would like to work this out, is actually the site of our conformity, and the public is the site where we can break from that conformity. So our symbolic identity is always particular, and it's always resistant to any universality or any universal solidarity. So symbolic identity isn't, so I think there's a link between symbolic identity, conformity, and particularity. And then universal solidarity can only emerge once we break out of whatever that particular identity that we're given is. So whatever we're born to some kind of particular identity, or we take it up. Right. So we can be born into some identity, or we can undergo a conversion and take up an identity. We can get educated and take up an identity. Like I can go through, get a PhD, and my identity could be professor, and I could really identify with that. What does that do, though? It makes me unable, the more I'm invested in myself as professor, the less I'm able to have any sense of universal solidarity with everyone else, because I'm more concerned with affirming my particularity. And okay, maybe I'll interact with people that share my symbolic identity, but I'm going to, in general, try to avoid any kind of universal connection, universal solidarity. So the alienation that the public brings is what actually makes this universality, this shared universality, apparent to us. So it's only when we lose that particularity that we get shared universality. So it's interesting that the conformity that Kierkegaard fears in The Present Age, the essay, it actually occurs in private life or in the community, not in the public. So I think Kierkegaard chose the wrong site to it, the wrong thing to attack. And this, I think it's not surprising. All these three thinkers that I just mentioned are conservative. I think it's not surprising that these conservative thinkers have a general suspicion of the public. And especially Kierkegaard and Heidegger, they see the community as what can provide a way of escaping from that, the public. But what they miss is the way in which it's the community that puts pressure on us to capitulate to the authority of the community. And this is, of course, most evident in Heidegger's own unfortunate bout with Nazism, right? That he did not see the way in which the oppressive function of the community at all, because for him, that community was emancipatory from the horror of the public. But he misses, I think, the way in which the community is itself oppressive, because it's the thing that's enforcing an identity. The community is the source of the they, not the public. And I think that's what Kierkegaard, Heidegger, they both miss. So we retreat into private conformity because the public represents a real challenge to our symbolic identity, and we want to find in privacy an affirmation of that symbolic identity, but we never end up finding it. So that's for me why the public is such an important site. But the public is constantly experiencing threats that try to transform it into a community. And I mentioned that I would talk about this later. So in an apartheid society, for instance, identity or money creates private communal hierarchies within the public. Like, you can only ride on the back of the bus, you can only walk on the street in this particular area, or you get a special place, on the public transportation, or this is a thing that's become common, you can pay extra to drive on a specific road that people that don't pay can't drive on it. So this idea that money can buy a certain kind of private space within the public. And that's part of this assault on the public engaged by the community because of the threat that the public poses to symbolic identity. The point is that every community tries its best to isolate subjects within their particularity, within a certain identity. And that's what it forces us to conform to if we're going to be part of the community. And if we don't conform enough, we occupy the figure of the excluded other that bonds the community together. So we're thrown out. So at any time, if you're ever in a community, you're constantly in danger of exile. You're constantly in danger of being excommunicated for failing to fully follow the particular demands that the community makes on you, for being too universal, for instance. So the point is that the community is trying to spare us from the disturbing encounter, like the one in Speed or like the one in North by Northwest. And the horror of the public is this confrontation with alienation. But again, this is what makes the public also emancipatory. And that's how we get to solidarity, through this sense of shared uprootedness rather than any kind of shared thing that we have in common. So what we have in common is, in a sense, what we don't have in common, I think, which is really, I think that's an important way to think of it. So the danger of the public for people, this is why I think it's avoided, is because it doesn't have this sense of exclusion to constitute it. And it doesn't function like a closed group. Instead, there's an openness to it there's not defined criteria for entry. There's not a certain thing that you do that gets you excluded. Instead, there's a constant negotiation of what's permitted and what's not permitted in the public. So I think one way we can see the public and the community operative is the way in which we respond to crises or to disasters. And a common thing that we do when we encounter a disaster is to retreat into the private community. But what's interesting about the disaster or the catastrophe or the crisis is that it creates this opportunity where we can go in either direction. Either we can move toward affirming the public, or we can retreat into the privacy of the community. And I think the disaster film really makes this choice clear. And it's almost, the choice is almost evident in the very structure of the different disaster films. So there's certain disaster films that show the classic disaster film, I think, really makes this choice for the community. And then there are more recent disaster films that are more about the way in which the disaster occasions a retreat into community. And so this is, I think, the way that we can think about this what I see as a fundamental choice that we have today, and then how the disaster film engages with that. So a relatively recent films from 2023, Leave the World Behind. In a sense, all is given away by the title. Some disaster happens while Ethan Hawke and Julia Roberts are on vacation, and they're staying in a vacation house, and the owner of the house comes back, and there's some initial conflict there, but finally the film ends when the two families decide, they find basically a survivalist fallout bunker basement that includes its own power supply and includes this huge collection of DVDs, including, this is one of the running gags of the film, including this is the two couples together, the guy and his daughter, and then the couple. So even though there's conflict inside, but in the end, privacy here trumps the public because there's so much danger out there. They retreat into this bunker, and then there's absolutely no affirmation of universality or solidarity in the film. There's a connection between the two families, but even that is a little tenuous because they're isolated. And then here you can see the massive collection, but the real thing is that the young daughter who has seen every episode of Friends up into the last and hasn't seen the last one, she hasn't seen how it ends. She finally she's here sitting down to watch the last episode. So it's this idea that, okay, they're stuck in this bunker, but look how nice it is. And you get completion, right? So you get to the point in which you didn't get to see the last, you got to see all of Friends, but you have one little piece is missing. Here you get to see everything. So if it was a disaster film that ended with an affirmation to the public, she'd have to say, well, I'm just going to have to live without ever seeing all of Friends, right? So there would be some kind of way in which you have to accept there's a disturbance, that's not everything is going to go right. So, and this is, I think, the tack of most disaster films, especially for the classics from the 70s, but then this new spate of disaster films in the 1990s and early 2000s, all of them, you see this kind of affirmation of the public versus what Leave the World Behind does, which is retreat into privacy. And I find it really compelling that the villain of most of these disaster films is someone who's a capitalist. So someone who insists on their particular interest, their particular identity at the expense of universal solidarity, at the expense of the public. So they've said, look, I'm going to retreat. I'm going to do my own thing. I don't care about the public. And so I want to show you a film from the 1990s called Volcano, which I think is a small little masterpiece. And you'll see there are two great scenes I want to show you. The first one is where this building developer, who two things happen. So his spouse is a trauma surgeon, and she's saving people's lives. And that's the scene I'm going to show you, is that she's saving people, and he just says, look, you don't help these people. You don't have any intrinsic connection to them. And she nonetheless is going to stay and help them. But then in order to divert the flow of lava, he's just built a huge high rise next to the Beverly Center in Los Angeles. And they have to topple it down to redirect the lava. So it's very heavy handed, but in a way that I find kind of appealing. So let's take a look at that scene in the film Volcano.
They put some kids in the mall, in the Hard Rock, I think.
Okay, you've done your duty. Can we go now?
Do you think there's a chance that she still might be there? Maybe. She was watching some children. Norman, hold this. What have we got? Thank you. Get this patient to surgery.
These people are strangers, Jay. Are you going to die for them? Jay, answer me.
I am answering you, Norman. This man's in cardiac arrest.
Okay, so that's one of my favorite all-time filmic scenes where she says, I am answering you by not answering you. It's a great way that absence is the form of her way of getting out of this, the really strong appeal of the private to get her out of the public. And he says they're strangers to you. And for her, that doesn't matter because she has this connection with them and the disaster makes it evident. So the point is that in the disaster, we see the way in which we're all the alien within comes to the fore. And then we can, as a response to that, we can affirm our universal solidarity. So here's the scene where this is again made. This is what I like about Volcano. It's not subtle. You'll see this is very evident here.
Every one of us.
Let's go find your mom. What's she look like?
She looks like... Look at their faces. They all look the same.
Okay, so the point is there's incredible contrast between Leaving the World Behind and a film like Volcano or a classic film like Towering Inferno, where the connection between the people is constituted through the trauma that the disaster creates and the alienation that the disaster makes evident. So I think we get this unique look at two different ways of possibly responding to crisis or disaster. One, I'm going to retreat and try to avoid solidarity because there's something terrifying about it, or I'm going to go enter into it. And I think in a way, the disaster film itself reflects the trajectory of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. That is, for Hegel, alienation is the basis of freedom. And I think there's so I said earlier that Marcuse, in a way, is turning away from Hegel in his book on Hegel by criticizing alienation, that Hegel is the real thinker of alienation as the source of emancipation. And for him, we're free insofar as we conceive of ourselves as alienated subjects. So subjectivity is really just Hegel's name for alienation. So to embrace our subjectivity is also to embrace our alienation. And that's the thing that connects us to others, in solidarity, in universal solidarity. So the problem that Hegel confronts is that we're constantly presupposing a substantial status to the other or to the object world. And that's what the phenomenology is, the movement of the text is both confronting and then working through and seeing how, what I thought was substantial is really also divided by itself. It also has, to put it in other words, it also has this alien within. So in a way, what the phenomenology is doing is seeing how everything that I thought was substantial or self-identical, I have to see the way in which there's an alien internal to that as well. And then that's how universality is constituted through the work. So the point is, again, that what appears substantial and independent is independent and not self-divided. So it's not this thing that's just independent and self-identical. Or as Hegel puts it, in my view, which must be justified by the exposition of the system itself, says this in the preface, everything hangs on grasping and expressing the true, not just as substance, but just as much as subject. And the point here is, I think, the way in this seeing what's substantial, which by substantial he means independent, autonomous, seeing the way in which that is also subject, divided, dependent, connected, and thus in solidarity, that's the real task of philosophy. So the point of Hegel's entire philosophical project is not overcoming alienation, but instead recognizing what are the ramifications of seeing alienation as universal, as seeing that there's no point that escapes from it. So at every step in the phenomenology, we're seeing, that's a point that seems to escape from alienation. And then, no, that doesn't escape from alienation. We can see there's alienation there too. So that's the key, that each position is a different kind of way to overcome or believe, a position we believe overcomes alienation. And Hegel's going to say, no, it doesn't. And this is the way that that position too is lacking. That position too suffers from an internal, an alien within, an internal distinction. Or, as Hegel puts it later, self-consciousness is only something. It only has reality insofar as it alienates itself from itself. So it's the being of subjectivity exists through its alienation. That really is a fundamental idea for Hegel. And I think this gets a little bit lost in the move from Hegel to Marx. And especially, so for certainly the Marx of the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, but then in the Marxist tradition of the 20th century, alienation really becomes the name. And even in our common everyday vocabulary, I even say this, that was a really, grading papers is very alienating. So I have ways in which I even adopt this language that alienation is a thing that's bad, that I want to try to get rid of or I want to try to overcome. And that's something that Hegel is against. And I think, so when he wrote this book in the 1970s, there were very few people that got Hegel right. I think Julian Rose in 1983 in her book, Hegel Contra Sociology, was one of the first. So Shlomo Avineri, I think, is really perspicacious, and he grasped that this is really the importance of Hegel contra, or at least in contradistinction to Marx. This is what he says. While Hegel sees alienation as a necessary aspect of objectification, Marx maintains that alienation does not reside immanently in the process of production itself, but only in its concrete historical conditions. For Marx, therefore, there exists the possibility of ultimate salvation, whereas for Hegel, one will never be able to dissociate the cross from the rose of the present. So this is a reference. If that sounds obscure, that's a reference to the preface to the Philosophy of Right by Hegel. But I think it's really crucial that for Hegel, our alienation is something that we not only cannot overcome, but we shouldn't be trying to overcome it, because it's when we embrace it that we find our universality. And I think this is how the great disaster films of the 1970s all ended. Thank you so much.